Hello, this is Francis from McCaffrey's Crafts, and today's episode 4 in my series about Irish stick fighting. And today I thought I'd discuss some of the theories that are out there regarding how stick fighting developed in Ireland. And to do this, we have to look a bit earlier. Like, as I mentioned in one of my earlier episodes, that 1805 in Tipperary seems to when it's officially can be traced to kicking off. But there's evidence that it went on there before that. So we have to look into what was happening in Ireland about 100 years beforehand to kind of get some theory of how stick fighting actually developed. So the thing with stick fighting is, remember that at first, the only weapon used by the factions was the stick. And there were schools of instruction in stick fighting, and the art was taught by masters or trainers, or they had various titles as well. And every faction had men that were highly skilled in stick fighting and fencing, swordplay. So again, they must have got some training, or they must have got some influence before this. And there is some theory regarding this, that if you remember back in the even 1600s, 1700s, a lot of Irish men would go to Europe to fight for various nations, like for France. There was always a very strong connection between Ireland and France, where a lot of Irish soldiers would go across to do that. And I have some notes here as well. So yeah, there was many people. This is the theory I'm going to kind of discuss today, is that the training of recruits of the Irish regiments for the European armies was how people became skilled in stick fighting and how it developed out of that. And I think that's quite a reasonable and good theory to kind of discuss, because it does make some sense, because it didn't just happen all of a sudden. Like in 1805, when it was noticed that these huge battles were going on, they were highly skilled, people would have been training for some time. Like, it wasn't just a complete melee and ruckus, although there was that aspect to it as well. There was also skilled fighters, and this has been recorded. So let's kind of just look there a little bit at the history here, and let me just kind of glaze over to my notes. So the fighting men first began to leave Ireland in force as far back as 1653. This was following all the mayhem of the Cromwellian conquest, when Cromwell came and did all his nasty things in Ireland. They continued to go after that right up until this thing called the Treaty of Limerick in 1691. Now, the Treaty of Limerick in 1691 forbid Irish soldiers to go to fight on the continent for armies, and any breach of this would carry the death penalty, both for the recruiters who would come over from Europe, as well as the recruits, like the Irish people. So in 1691, it became illegal for Irish people to go to Europe. So all this did is it became underground. Like, the Irish regiment soldiers were quite renowned in Europe, especially in France. They were highly valued as well. They were highly trained. And, it just became illegal. It just became like a smuggling operation. People wouldn't wear uniforms anymore. It all just became kind of underground. And there's two kind of references that we can go through today. There's a book by this guy called Matthew O'Connor, and it's called The Military History of the Irish Nation, and this came out in 1845. And he kind of discusses some of the there's a whole list in his book about the instruction for the officer deputed to raise recruits for the Irish Brigade, drawn up by Lord Clare and approved by Marshal Saxe. It was operative from 1741. And O'Connor, in his book, he mentions that the difficulty experienced by Irish colonels in raising sufficient Irish recruits to replace the losses sustained by the European regiments. So again, in his book there, he's discussing that this was going on, and that is there, to backs up the theory that there is quite a lot of evidence from that book as well about the recruitment and training of soldiers in Ireland to go to to Europe as well. So that's kind of like important to know along the way. Also, there's like again, the smugglers' route used to go in actually, like Calais and Boulogne, I think it's pronounced. My French is terrible. But yeah, so like that was kind of the shortest route between Ireland and Calais. Like there's a ferry from Calais at the moment and stuff. So usually it was always in through there. And but then there's another reference I kind of want to mention today by a guy called Philip Rooney. And he was a novelist and historian from County Kerry, same as myself. And he wrote in the Kerryman newspaper in December, 1956. Again, he was discussing these recruitment campaigns. And he says that these recruiting campaigns were not hurried affairs. More often than not, the recruiting officer from abroad spent months in their chosen districts, selecting their men, waiting for the ship that would take them safely away. While he waited, the men from the continental armies trained their recruits, and they would hand over their squads of Irishmen in France and in Spain. So it was mostly France and Spain. So this shows that there was training going on in Ireland, and the training was done with sticks. Because you see, Irish people weren't allowed to hold arms. There wasn't guns, there wasn't like loads of swords lying around that people could use. So again, like anything, you have to use what is available for you. So recruiting agents, they trained Irish instructors or fencing masters to use sticks, and they use these sticks for teaching fencing and swordplay to the Irish. So that, and here's just a quote from that article. The training of Irish lads in the use of the 3-foot-long cudgel or oak or ash or holly was no haphazard affair. It was no happy-go-lucky business of hard-hitting and wild hopping for the lucky blow that would split a skull. Stick fighting, as taught by experts, was every bit as skilled as sword fighting. Thrust and parry, feint and counter. It had its own rules, its own subtle skills. The men trained in the game became experts in attack and defense. So there's clear evidence out there that there were schools of stick fighters. There was evidence that they were highly skilled. There was evidence that they were trained for a long period of time to become experts in this. So imagine back in those days, Irish lads going back and forth, fighting in France, coming back, fighting in France, recruiting more, training more. So there's this kind of culture within Ireland that's more underground of stick fighting. They're training with sticks. Swordplay and fencing training seems to be the backbone of what was happening in the 1700s between Ireland. So again, I think this is quite a valid argument that stick fighting could have developed, and is a very good theory, a very plausible theory, could have developed out of this, given that a lot of the sword play. And again, you must remember in Europe that if American guys out there would be like, well, didn't they have guns back in those days? But like right up until the 1800s, people would use swords. They still was issued to recruits. Like even O'Connor mentions in his Military History of the Irish Nation book that even in 1744, an Irish brigade, their weapons they would have a belt, a sword, cartouche, powdered horn, firelock, and bayonet. This was like standard issue, and that was recorded in 1744. Even models of the infantry of the regiment of Dillon in 1779 are equipped likewise, similar. And even the Irish battalion of 1808 in the army of Napoleon also were issued with swords. So swords were used quite frequently in battles within Europe at this time. And again, I think this is very interesting. So you could say actually a lot of influence came from France, maybe from Spain to a lesser extent, that led to the Irish stick fighting, that a lot of these French masters would come over as well. They would recruit Irish people. So there's a good connection even between the stick fighting between the nations of Ireland and France. And again, that's what, like, you know, a lot of this is theory based on what books were out there, what history, what newspaper clippings. And again, it's you know, it is hard enough subject to kind of research because again, this was kind of like underground, this was illegal, but we do have some historical references along the way. So yeah, we'll kind of leave it at that there for today, and we'll continue in our series the next day. Thank you.